You fired the only man keeping this company alive." Nobody said those words out loud that morning, but 3 hours later, everyone on the 42nd floor of HelixPoint Financial Systems would be thinking them. At 7:12 a.m., Madeline Pierce stepped out of the executive elevator with the sharp, controlled pace of someone determined to prove she belonged there. The entire operations floor changed the moment she appeared. Conversations stopped. Chairs straightened. Screens minimized. HelixPoint processed real-time payment infrastructure for more than 3,000 financial institutions across the United States, and this was Madeline's first Monday as CEO. 29 years old. Stanford graduate. Ruthless reputation. Daughter of the company's founder. She had spent the last 6 years fighting to be taken seriously in rooms full of older men who smiled too carefully when she spoke. Now she finally had control of the company, and she intended to fix what she called the culture of tolerated weakness. Her heels clicked across the polished floor as senior managers followed behind her, holding tablets and coffee cups they barely touched. She stopped near the center of the operations room without warning. 18 monitors glowed in front of one workstation. Streams of transaction data moved across the screens in endless lines of green and white. Error alerts blinked in silent corners. And in the middle of it all, asleep with his head resting on folded arms beside a cold cup of coffee, sat Caleb Monroe. His gray button-up shirt was wrinkled. His badge hung loosely from his belt. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes like bruises left behind by exhaustion itself. One manager gave an awkward laugh under his breath. Another looked away immediately. Madeline stared for 3 full seconds. "Who is that?" she asked. Nobody answered right away. Finally, a nervous supervisor cleared his throat. "That's Caleb Monroe, senior systems engineer." Madeline's expression hardened instantly. "He's asleep during active operations?" The supervisor hesitated. "Well, yes, technically, but unacceptable." Her voice cut through the room cleanly enough to stop every keyboard nearby. Caleb stirred slightly at the sound, but didn't fully wake. Madeline stepped closer. "Mr. Monroe." No response. She looked back at security. "Wake him up." A guard approached carefully and touched Caleb's shoulder once. Caleb opened his eyes slowly, disoriented for half a second, then immediately looked toward the center monitor. Not at the people around him. Not at the CEO. The monitor. Like his brain had returned to the system before returning to the room. He reached for the keyboard automatically. "Cluster 7 status?" he asked quietly. The supervisor blinked. "Caleb," but Madeline interrupted before anyone else could speak. "You're done here." The room froze. Caleb finally looked at her directly. Calm. Tired. Completely unreadable. Madeline crossed her arms. "Sleeping during operational hours on my first day conducting a standards review?" She shook her head once. "Turn in your badge." One of the engineers nearby shifted uncomfortably. Another stared at his screen, pretending not to listen. Caleb looked around the room slowly, then back at the monitors in front of him. Tiny red warning symbols blinked across 2 lower windows. His eyes stopped there for just a fraction too long. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I need 5 minutes. You already had enough time to take a nap at your desk." A few nervous laughs escaped from the back row. Caleb didn't react to them. "The system isn't stable yet," he said. "I just need to finish isolating security." Her tone sharpened instantly. "Escort him out." The guard stepped closer. Caleb looked at the screens one last time. Then he slowly removed his access badge and placed it on the desk beside the cold coffee. No argument. No anger. Just exhaustion. As he stood, the entire operations floor noticed something for the first time. His left hand was trembling slightly, like his body had finally reached its limit. Madeline didn't notice. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Caleb picked up an old canvas backpack from beneath the desk. A small folded piece of paper slipped halfway out of the side pocket. Crayon drawing. A little girl holding hands with a taller figure under a yellow sun. He pushed it back inside before anyone could. Look closely. Then he walked toward the elevators in complete silence while 18 monitors continued blinking behind him. The elevator doors closed in front of Caleb Monroe without a single person trying to stop him. Back on the operations floor, the silence lasted only a few seconds before keyboards started moving again. Quiet conversations returned. Chairs rolled. Someone near the back muttered, "First day, and she already fired somebody." Another answered, "Honestly, the guy was asleep. What did he expect?" Madeline Pierce heard both comments and ignored them. She walked toward the central glass conference room overlooking the operations floor, her reflection following her across the polished windows like a second version of herself moving just half a step behind. Inside the room, executives immediately opened tablets and presentation files. Numbers filled the wall screens. Revenue projections, infrastructure modernization plans, staffing reductions, efficiency metrics. Madeline remained standing at the head of the table. "I want every department reviewed by Friday," she said. "No exceptions. If people cannot maintain professional standards in a company this important, they should not be here." Several executives nodded quickly. One did not. Daniel Mercer, the company's chief infrastructure officer, sat near the far end of the table with his hands folded. 58 years old. Calm voice. Gray suit that always looked slightly wrinkled no matter how expensive it was. He had been with HelixPoint longer than almost anyone still employed there. "Caleb has been here 11 years, Daniel said carefully. Madeline looked at him. "And he is not usually careless. He was unconscious at his desk during live operations." Daniel paused before answering. "That is true." But his eyes drifted briefly toward the operations floor below, toward the empty workstation with 18 active monitors still running. Madeline noticed. "If there is something I should know, Mr. Mercer, now would be a very good time." Daniel hesitated 1 second too long. "Nothing formal," he finally said. "Then we move on." She tapped the conference table once. "I inherited a company where people stopped enforcing standards because they were afraid of discomfort. That ends now." Nobody argued after that. 40 floors below, Caleb stepped out of the building into the cold Manhattan morning, carrying the same worn canvas backpack over one shoulder. The city moved around him without noticing him at all. Black SUVs rolled past. Taxi horns echoed between glass towers. Office workers crossed intersections balancing coffee cups and phones. Caleb stopped near the curb and closed his eyes for 2 full seconds like his body was trying to shut itself down, standing upright. Then his phone vibrated. The screen lit up with a picture of a little girl smiling with missing front teeth. "Nora." Caleb answered immediately. "Hey, Bug. Daddy." Her voice sounded small and sleepy. "Are you coming tonight?" Caleb looked across the street without really seeing it. "Tonight. My science night." Silence. Just long enough for guilt to arrive. "Right," he said softly. "The volcano. You forgot again." Caleb rubbed his forehead. "No, I did not forget. His voice faded. He had forgotten. Or maybe exhaustion had erased the space in his brain where normal life was supposed to exist. Across the street, a digital billboard changed advertisements 3 times before he noticed Nora was still waiting for an answer. "I will be there," he said firmly. "Promise." Caleb looked down at his trembling hand. "Yeah," he answered quietly. "I promise." Back inside HelixPoint, the operations floor continued running normally for exactly 36 more minutes. Then a junior systems analyst frowned at his monitor. "That is weird." Nobody looked up. He leaned closer. "Why are the Singapore relay logs repeating?" Another engineer rolled his chair over. "What?" The analyst pointed at the screen. Duplicate authentication requests were appearing inside the international transaction queue. Same timestamps. Same encrypted headers. Same routing signatures. Again and again. The second engineer stared for 3 seconds before his expression changed completely. "Wait." He grabbed his keyboard. Another alert appeared. Then another. Small. Quiet. Easy to miss. Down the row, one monitor suddenly flashed red for half a second before returning to normal. Nobody in the room noticed that part except Daniel Mercer. And when he saw it, the color slowly disappeared from his face. Daniel Mercer was already moving before the second alert finished flashing across the monitor. "Pull the relay logs," he said sharply. The junior analyst beside him swallowed hard and typed faster. Around them, conversations on the operations floor began slowing one by one as engineers noticed the same thing appearing across multiple systems. Duplicate authentication requests. Hidden traffic loops. Tiny synchronization failures repeating in patterns too precise to be random. One engineer looked up from his station. "Why is Cluster 7 rejecting internal verification?" Nobody answered immediately. Another alert appeared. Then another. The sound itself was quiet. Just soft electronic chimes across a room designed to handle thousands of notifications a day. But something about these felt different. The rhythm was wrong. Daniel stepped toward Caleb's abandoned workstation. 18 monitors still glowed with unfinished processes. Security maps, transaction queues, traffic reroutes. On the center screen sat a command window filled with lines of handwritten overrides, temporary bypasses, redirect layers, manual isolation barriers. Daniel's eyes narrowed slowly. "Oh God," he whispered. One of the engineers nearby looked over. "What?" Daniel pointed at the screen. "These were not here yesterday." The engineer moved closer. "What are they?" Daniel did not answer immediately because he already knew. Caleb had been building containment walls by hand, quietly, without approval, without documentation, like someone trying to stop a flood while pretending the building was still safe. Upstairs, Madeline Pierce stood in another executive meeting discussing infrastructure cost reduction when her assistant stepped quickly into the room. "Miss Pierce." Madeline looked up, annoyed by the interruption. "What?" "Daniel Mercer says he needs you downstairs immediately." "I am busy." He said it cannot wait. The room went silent at the expression on the assistant's face. Madeline closed the tablet in front of her and stood without another word. Back on the operations floor, tension had replaced routine completely. Engineers moved faster now. Chairs rolled between workstations. Screens shifted from green to amber. One analyst suddenly sat upright. "I found the source pattern." Daniel turned immediately. "Show me." The analyst enlarged the traffic map onto the central display wall. Hundreds of tiny transaction requests moved through the network in carefully spaced intervals. Not random spam. Not brute force attacks. Controlled. Patient. Learning. "That is impossible," one engineer whispered. Daniel stared at the screen without blinking. He had seen this kind of behavior once before 12 years ago during a breach attempt against a Federal Reserve contractor. Quiet infiltration. Mapping architecture slowly enough to avoid detection. He looked back toward Caleb's workstation again, then at the unfinished command lines still running silently in the background. "He knew," Daniel said quietly. Caleb knew. Madeline arrived just as another monitor turned red. "What is happening?" she demanded. Nobody answered quickly enough. Daniel finally faced her. "We have an active intrusion moving through the transaction network." Madeline's expression hardened instantly, then isolated. Daniel's jaw tightened. "It is already inside." The room became very still after that. Madeline stepped toward the display wall. "How long?" One engineer hesitated. "We are not sure." Daniel looked directly at the scrolling logs. "At least 48 hours." Madeline turned sharply toward him. 48. Daniel nodded once. "And somebody has been trying to contain it manually." His eyes drifted toward Caleb's empty chair again. Madeline followed the look this time. For the first time since morning, uncertainty crossed her face. A systems analyst suddenly cursed under his breath. "We just lost 2 verification relays in Chicago." Another voice followed immediately. "Boston is showing replication delays." Phoenix just flagged unauthorized packet mirroring. The alerts began multiplying faster now. Red. Amber. Red again. The operations floor no longer sounded like an office. It sounded like pressure building inside something too large to stop once it started moving. Madeline stared at Caleb's monitors. One unfinished message blinked at the bottom corner of the center screen beside a timestamp from 43 minutes earlier. Access lockout interrupted containment sequence. Beneath it sat a final line Caleb never had the chance to finish typing. "Do not let anyone restart Cluster 7. The operations floor erupted into motion the moment the 4th relay failed. Engineers rushed between stations carrying tablets and half-finished theories, while warning alerts spread across the wall displays faster than anyone could read them. Madeline Pierce stood in the center of it all trying to maintain control, but for the first time that morning, the room was no longer moving according to her decisions. "I want every external connection monitored," she ordered. "Lock down unnecessary traffic." "We already tried," one analyst answered without looking away from his screen. "The requests keep rerouting through mirrored channels." "Then shut those down too." Daniel Mercer stepped beside her. "If we start cutting random pathways without understanding the architecture, we could collapse the settlement queues ourselves." Madeline looked at him sharply. "Then explain to me what exactly Caleb Monroe was doing." Daniel stared at the unfinished code still moving across Caleb's monitors. "Keeping us alive." The answer landed harder than anyone expected. Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Then another alert hit the system. International transfer latency exceeded safe thresholds. London, Singapore, Dallas. One by one, transaction clusters started slowing beneath invisible pressure. Daniel leaned closer to Caleb's workstation. The temporary reroute layers were collapsing now that nobody was maintaining them manually. Handwritten scripts sat stacked across multiple terminals like emergency patches holding together an old bridge in the middle of a storm. "This does not make sense," one engineer muttered. "Why would he not report this?" Daniel answered quietly without turning around. Maybe he did. Across the room, Madeline's assistant approached carefully holding a printed personnel file. "Ms. Pierce." Madeline grabbed it impatiently. "Caleb Monroe, age 36, senior systems engineer, 11 years with HelixPoint, emergency infrastructure specialist certification, legacy architecture clearance." Her eyes moved down the page. No disciplinary record, no formal complaints, no vacation time used in 19 months. Madeline frowned slightly. 19 months. The assistant nodded nervously. Human Resources flagged it twice. He never submitted leave requests. Daniel overheard that part. Because every time the system failed overnight, Caleb stayed. Madeline looked at him. "You are telling me one engineer was carrying this entire network?" "I am telling you," Daniel replied carefully, "that most of this company stopped understanding its own infrastructure years ago." Caleb did not. Another engineer suddenly raised his voice. "Wait." Everyone turned toward him. "I found hidden process loops inside Cluster 7. He enlarged the code onto the central display. Thousands of tiny instructions buried beneath standard transaction management layers. Sleeping code. Waiting. Madeline stepped closer. "What is it?" Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Daniel spoke. "A trigger." The room went still again. "Meaning?" Madeline asked. Daniel's expression darkened. "Meaning whoever built this wanted something very specific to happen before activation." "What activates it?" The engineer at the keyboard swallowed hard. "System restart." Three different people looked toward Cluster 7's maintenance dashboard at the exact same moment. One operations manager standing near the back suddenly froze. "Oh no." Daniel turned immediately. "What?" The manager looked pale now. "At 8:05, after Caleb's access was revoked, we initiated an automated stabilization reboot on Cluster 7. Silence. Complete silence. Even the keyboard stopped. Madeline stared at him. "You did what?" "It was standard protocol," he answered weakly. The queue latency was increasing, and he stopped speaking because every monitor on the floor suddenly flashed red at the same time. Not one screen. All of them. The sound that followed was worse than shouting. Hundreds of quiet alert tones firing together across 40,000 square feet of operation space. Then transaction failures started appearing in waves. Payment authorization rejected. Settlement synchronization lost. Internal verification timeout. An analyst near the center row whispered, "Dear God." Daniel looked at the central display as entire sections of the network map turned crimson. "The trigger is active." Madeline's face lost color for the first time all morning. "Can we stop it?" Daniel did not answer right away because he already knew the truth. The one person who might have known how was walking somewhere in Manhattan right now with his company badge disabled and his phone probably turned off. 43 minutes after Caleb Monroe walked out of HelixPoint, the company began losing nearly $400,000 every minute. Nobody announced that number out loud, but everyone on the operations floor could feel it growing behind every red alert flashing across the screens. Transaction failures spread from domestic banks into international settlement queues. Clients started calling, then regulators, then partner institutions demanding answers nobody had yet. Madeline Pierce stood motionless near the center display while executives circled around her speaking too quickly and too quietly at the same time. "We need public relations prepared. Legal wants an incident timeline. Chicago just lost synchronization again. The backup relays are rejecting mirrored packets." Every sentence sounded worse than the last. Daniel Mercer ignored all of them. He sat at Caleb's abandoned workstation scrolling through layers of unfinished command logs with the concentration of someone trying to read another person's thoughts before time ran out. Then he stopped suddenly. "Here." Madeline stepped closer immediately. "What is it?" Daniel enlarged a hidden process window buried beneath the transaction maps. Timestamps filled the screen going back nearly 48 hours. Every few minutes, Caleb had manually redirected traffic, isolated suspicious nodes, rewritten authentication pathways, and blocked unauthorized relay escalation one system at a time. Thousands of interventions. Thousands. Madeline stared at the logs in disbelief. He did all this himself? Daniel nodded slowly. And he never escalated beyond middle management because they probably told him not to create panic before your first week as chief executive. One of the analysts nearby looked up. Wait. He pointed toward another log entry. These requests started Saturday night. Another engineer checked the timestamps. He never went home. Silence moved across the room again. Not dramatic. Worse than that. Quiet understanding. Caleb had not fallen asleep because he was lazy. He had collapsed because his body finally shut down after holding together a live financial network for 2 straight days. Madeline looked toward the empty chair beside the 18 monitors. The cold coffee cup was still sitting there untouched. A folded jacket hung over the backrest. For the first time since morning, the image of Caleb asleep at the desk replayed differently in her mind. Not careless. Exhausted. One operations manager approached nervously. Ms. Pierce, we are receiving transfer suspension notices from 2 federal clearing partners. How long before the network fails completely? She asked. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Daniel spoke without looking away from the screen. If the activation sequence spreads into the primary reconciliation architecture, maybe 2 hours. The words landed like concrete in the room. Madeline folded her arms tighter. Then stop it. Daniel finally turned toward her directly. We do not know how. Another alert fired across the central display wall. Internal authentication conflict detected. Seconds later, 3 more appeared. One analyst removed his glasses and rubbed both eyes hard. Another whispered, "This thing is learning the reroutes." Daniel's expression darkened further. No, it already learned them. He opened another hidden folder inside Caleb's workstation. This one contained handwritten notes time-stamped throughout the night. Half-finished observations. Emergency mapping sketches. Temporary workarounds. At the bottom sat one final note entered less than 15 minutes before Madeline arrived that morning. If cluster 7 restarts before the relay shell is isolated, entire verification layer could collapse within 3 hours. Do not allow automated stabilization under any circumstance. Madeline read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Nobody spoke while she stared at it. Finally, she asked the question nobody wanted to answer. Who approved the restart? Across the room, the operations manager slowly lowered his head. Nobody defended him. Nobody needed to. The consequences were already crawling across every screen in the building. Then Daniel noticed something else sitting partially beneath Caleb's keyboard. A small spiral notebook. Worn edges. Coffee stains. He opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten maintenance notes mixed with grocery reminders and rough drawings made in crayon. One page near the middle showed a child's handwriting pressed unevenly across the paper. Dad fixes the computers so people can buy food. Madeline looked at the sentence and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Because suddenly the exhausted man she fired that morning no longer looked invisible at all. By 10:14 a.m., HelixPoint Financial Systems had entered full containment protocol. Conference rooms became emergency command centers. Legal teams filled hallways carrying printed compliance binders no one had touched in years. Phones rang without stopping. The calm corporate rhythm of the building had disappeared completely. Now the entire tower moved with the nervous energy of people realizing they no longer understood the machine they depended on. Madeline Pierce stood inside the glass operations room staring at the network map spread across the main display wall. Entire sections of the country were turning amber and red. Delayed settlements. Frozen verification chains. Escalating authentication conflicts. Every few seconds another alert appeared somewhere new. How bad? She asked quietly. Daniel Mercer answered without looking up from Caleb's workstation. Worse than it looks. One of the engineers nearby suddenly raised his voice. The shellcode just copied itself into the Denver relay. Another analyst swore under his breath. It is using the internal trust architecture against us. Madeline looked toward Daniel. Explain that in English. Daniel finally stood and faced her directly. The attack is pretending to be us. He pointed toward the scrolling authentication layers on the display. Every time the system trusts one of its own relays, the malicious requests move deeper without triggering standard defenses. Madeline folded her arms tightly. Then isolate the infected sections. We already tried. Try harder. Daniel's expression hardened for the first time all morning. This is not a server outage, Madeline. Whoever built this understood our infrastructure at an architectural level. The room went quiet again after that sentence because everyone understood what he meant. This was not random. Somebody had studied HelixPoint carefully for a long time. Then another alert appeared. Primary clearing delay exceeded federal limits. One executive near the doorway whispered, "If regulators suspend us," nobody finished the sentence. They did not need to. The consequences were obvious. Madeline walked back toward Caleb's workstation again. The small notebook still sat open beside the keyboard. Grocery lists, maintenance notes, handwritten diagrams, tiny pieces of a life squeezed between emergency fixes. One page caught her attention this time. Saturday, 2:40 a.m. Nora asleep on couch in break room again. Need to finish relay isolation before morning traffic spike. Madeline stared at the sentence longer than she intended to. He brought his daughter here? Daniel nodded once. Twice this month. Why? Daniel looked genuinely confused by the question. Because he could not leave. Across the floor, one analyst suddenly shouted, "We are losing archive synchronization." Another engineer spun around in his chair. That is impossible. It is happening. Red warnings spread across the backup infrastructure displays. Systems that were supposed to exist only as emergency protection were now being touched too. Daniel moved instantly back to the keyboard. His fingers flew across commands while multiple engineers gathered around him. "No," he muttered quietly. "No, no, no." Madeline stepped closer. "What?" Daniel enlarged another hidden process chain. Caleb had buried beneath the emergency reroute layers. More handwritten warnings appeared. If shell reaches archive mirrors, do not purge corrupted queues manually. Recursive trigger suspected. One engineer looked pale now. We already started manual purge prep 20 minutes ago. Daniel closed his eyes briefly like someone trying not to curse. Stop immediately. Why? Because Caleb thought the attack wanted us to panic. Another silence. Then realization spread slowly through the room. Every standard response they had used since morning had pushed the attack deeper instead of stopping it. Madeline looked back at the unfinished command windows covering Caleb's 18 monitors. Temporary walls. Redirects. Isolations. Every messy handwritten patch suddenly looked less like chaos and more like a man trying to hold shut a collapsing door with his bare hands. Then one final alert appeared at the top of the central display in bright red letters large enough for the entire floor to see. Federal Oversight Review automatically initiated. Nobody moved after that. Not even the phones. Because everyone in the room understood the same terrifying thing at the exact same moment. HelixPoint was no longer fighting embarrassment. It was fighting survival. At 11:03 a.m., the first major client threatened to pull its contracts from HelixPoint Financial Systems. Nobody on the executive floor said the word panic out loud, but it moved through the building anyway. Quiet. Fast. Unstoppable. Senior managers stopped pretending this was temporary. Legal teams sealed conference rooms. Public relations staff drafted emergency statements they hoped would never be released. Down on the operations floor, engineers looked exhausted already, and it was not even noon. Madeline Pierce stood near Caleb Monroe's workstation staring at the growing wall of alerts reflecting across the glass around her. Every few seconds, another warning appeared somewhere in the network. Settlement delays. Verification failures. Relay corruption. The system was unraveling in slow motion. Daniel Mercer remained at Caleb's desk reading through another layer of hidden logs. Then he stopped suddenly. Wait. Madeline turned immediately. What now? Daniel opened a private monitoring folder buried beneath 6 different administrative layers. Hundreds of screenshots appeared across the monitor. Timestamps. Security captures. Packet traces. Caleb had been documenting everything. One analyst leaned closer. He tracked the attack manually? Daniel nodded slowly. He was building evidence while containing it. Madeline watched the screens silently. 48 hours of work sat spread across 18 monitors like pieces of a war nobody else realized had already started. Another engineer approached holding a tablet. We recovered archived camera footage from overnight operations. Daniel looked up sharply. Show me. The engineer connected the footage to the central display wall. Grainy black and white security video filled the room. Saturday night. Empty operations floor. 2:13 a.m. Caleb sat alone beneath the glow of the monitors, typing continuously while transaction maps flickered across his screens. A half-eaten vending machine sandwich sat untouched beside him. The footage jumped forward. 4:41 a.m. Same chair. Same posture. Same monitors. Then another jump. 6:08 a.m. Caleb stood briefly, stretched one arm against the edge of the desk, drank cold coffee, and immediately sat back down. Nobody spoke while the footage continued. Hour after hour. Caleb never left the operations floor except once at dawn Sunday morning. The next clip appeared. He returned carrying a small backpack and holding the hand of a little girl in a winter coat. Nora. She looked half asleep, clutching a stuffed rabbit against her chest, while Caleb guided her quietly through the empty office. Madeline stared at the screen without blinking. Caleb settled Nora onto a couch inside the break room with a blanket and coloring books before returning immediately to the monitors. Another jump in footage. 11:32 p.m. Nora asleep on the couch, while Caleb worked alone beneath flashing red alerts. Midnight. 2 in the morning. 3. He never stopped moving between screens. Never rested longer than a few minutes. One analyst whispered softly, "Jesus." The footage advanced to Monday morning. 6:51 a.m. Caleb still at the workstation. Shoulders slumped now. Eyes barely open. He typed another manual reroute command, with visibly shaking hands. Then the final clip appeared. 7:09 a.m. Caleb looked toward the operations entrance as the elevator doors opened somewhere off camera. He glanced once at the center monitors, checked the transaction map one final time, and lowered his head onto folded arms for what should have been only a moment. 3 minutes later, Madeline Pierce walked onto the floor and fired him. Nobody in the room moved after the footage ended. Nobody even looked at Madeline. They did not need to. The silence itself had weight now, heavy enough to press against the glass walls around them. Madeline kept staring at the frozen image of Caleb asleep at the desk, while 18 monitors continued glowing around him. But now the scene looked completely different than it had that morning. Not laziness. Not disrespect. A man reaching the physical limit of exhaustion after spending 2 straight days protecting a company that had just thrown him out the door. Then another alert exploded across the central display wall in bright red letters. Primary Federal Settlement Channel offline. One engineer whispered the words nobody wanted to hear. "We are running out of time." At 11:47 a.m., the first national news alert about HelixPoint Financial Systems appeared online. Nobody needed to say it out loud anymore. The situation was escaping the building. Analysts from federal oversight agencies were requesting direct access to transaction records. Partner banks had begun activating emergency contingency plans. Somewhere on the 39th floor, an investor relations executive reportedly vomited in a restroom after hearing preliminary loss estimates. Down in operations, nobody even reacted anymore. They were too busy trying to stop the system from collapsing completely. Madeline Pierce stood near the center monitors watching engineers move around her with growing desperation. The confidence she walked into the building with that morning was gone now, replaced by something colder. The realization that she had misunderstood both the company and the man she fired from it. Daniel Mercer suddenly looked up from Caleb Monroe's workstation. "I found another hidden archive." Several engineers moved closer immediately. Daniel opened an encrypted maintenance directory buried beneath old infrastructure folders nobody had touched in years. Inside sat dozens of private incident recordings Caleb had apparently made during overnight maintenance shifts. Audio logs, system snapshots, emergency notes. One file near the top caught Daniel's attention. Sunday, 3:14 a.m. He opened it. Caleb's tired voice filled the room through the overhead speakers. Authentication shell adapted again at 2:58. Manual containment holding for now. If anybody besides me is reviewing this later, do not restart Cluster 7 under any circumstances. The trigger is recursive. Static crackled softly in the background along with keyboard clicks. Caleb continued. "I think they are waiting for us to panic." The room stayed completely silent while his voice played. Calm, exhausted, focused, not dramatic. Somehow that made it worse. Another file opened automatically afterward. Sunday, 11:42 p.m. Caleb sounded weaker this time. Nora finally asleep in the break room. "I promised her pancakes tomorrow morning." Probably lied again. A few people lowered their eyes after hearing that. Madeline did not move at all. Caleb continued speaking quietly into the recording. If this spreads into the archive mirrors before isolation finishes, there is a chance the settlement layer becomes unrecoverable. He paused briefly before adding one final sentence. If that happens, HelixPoint probably does not survive. Nobody breathed for a second after the recording ended. Then an analyst near the far row suddenly shouted, "We lost another clearing route." The central map flashed red again. Multiple settlement corridors across the Midwest disappeared from the network display one by one. Daniel immediately started typing faster. No. Madeline stepped closer. "Tell me what to do." Daniel stopped typing long enough to look directly at her. "Get Caleb back." The answer hit the room harder than another alarm. One executive near the doorway spoke carefully. "You think he can still stop this?" Daniel looked genuinely stunned by the question. He already was stopping it. Silence followed again. Then another engineer spoke quietly from the operations row. "His company phone is offline. Try personal records," Madeline ordered immediately. "Emergency contacts. Banking information. Anything." The human resources manager hesitated. "There are privacy restrictions." Madeline turned toward him sharply enough that he stopped speaking instantly. "Our federal settlement channels are failing in real time. Find him." Across the room, Daniel opened one final recording. Monday, 6:37 a.m., less than 40 minutes before Madeline fired him. Caleb's breathing sounded uneven now, exhausted beyond hiding it. Temporary barriers holding, but not stable. If Cluster 7 reboots before relay isolation completes, activation spreads into reconciliation architecture. He paused for several seconds before continuing softly. "I am so tired." The room froze after hearing that sentence. No anger, no self-pity, just simple exhaustion from a man who had spent 48 straight hours carrying pressure nobody else even understood existed. Then the recording ended. Nobody spoke afterward because suddenly every person on the operations floor understood the exact same thing. Caleb Monroe had not failed HelixPoint that morning. HelixPoint had failed him. At 12:26 p.m., Madeline Pierce made the first call herself. She stood alone inside the executive conference room overlooking the operations floor while chaos moved beneath the glass walls below her. Engineers rushed between stations. Red alerts continued flashing across every major display in the building. Federal oversight representatives were now on secured video lines demanding updates every 15 minutes. But none of that mattered in the moment her phone rang and went straight to voicemail. Madeline lowered the device slowly from her ear. "Again," Daniel Mercer said from beside the doorway. She called a second time. Voicemail again. Her jaw tightened. "Try his emergency contacts," she said quietly. Human resources had already pulled everything available. One listed relative deceased. No secondary guardian listed for Nora. Monroe. A landlord contact from Queens. An elementary school emergency form. That was it. Caleb Monroe had spent 11 years inside one of the most important financial infrastructure companies in the country, while somehow remaining nearly invisible to everyone except the systems he protected. Daniel stepped beside her holding another printed report. "We just lost secondary reconciliation support in Atlanta." Madeline closed her eyes briefly. "How long?" "Maybe 90 minutes before cascading settlement failures." He hesitated before continuing carefully. "Less if archive corruption spreads." Madeline looked down through the glass toward Caleb's empty workstation. The cold coffee cup still sat there untouched. Nobody had moved it. Somehow the entire operations floor had begun orbiting around that abandoned desk, like people standing around the outline of something important they only recognized after it disappeared. Then one of the assistants entered quickly. "We found him." Every person in the room turned instantly. "Where?" "Public School 217 in Queens." Madeline frowned. "A school." His daughter's science fair started at noon. Silence. Daniel looked at the clock on the wall. Caleb had still gone. After 48 hours awake. After being publicly fired. After carrying an entire company through a cyberattack almost alone. He still kept the promise he made to his daughter that morning. Madeline grabbed her coat immediately. "Prepare the car." Daniel blinked once. "You are going yourself?" Madeline looked at him directly. "I fired him myself." 10 minutes later, a black sedan pushed through midday Manhattan traffic while phone calls continued flooding into the vehicle through the speaker system. regulators, clients, board members. Madeline ignored most of them. Beside her, Daniel reviewed live status updates from the operations center. Containment layers are collapsing faster now, he said quietly. Without Caleb's manual reroutes, the trigger keeps adapting. Madeline stared out the window without answering. For the first time in years, she could not stop replaying her own mistake in her head. Caleb asleep at the desk, the shaking in his hand, the unfinished warning on the monitor, the little crayon drawing in his backpack. She had walked into the operations floor wanting strength, discipline, authority, and she had mistaken exhaustion for weakness because she had never bothered to ask what exhaustion costs a person before it finally shows on their face. The sedan stopped outside Public School 217 at 12:54 p.m. Children's artwork covered the front hallway walls. Baking soda volcanoes sat on folding tables beneath fluorescent lights. Parents moved through the gymnasium carrying paper coffee cups and smiling politely at science displays built from cardboard and glue. The atmosphere felt so painfully normal that for a second Madeline forgot HelixPoint was still collapsing 20 miles away.